was sick, sick unto death, with the long agony, and when they at length unbound me and I was permitted to sit, I felt that my senses were leaving me. The dread sentence of death was the last of distinct accusation which reached my ears. After that, the sound of inquisitorial voices seemed merged into one dreamy, interdetermined hum. It conveyed to my soul the idea of revolution, perhaps from the association in fancy with the burr of the mill wheel. This only for a brief period, for presently I heard no more. Yet for a while I saw, but with how terrible an exaggeration. Very suddenly there came back to my soul motion and sound, the tumultuous motion of the heart, and in my ears the sound of its beating. Then a pause in which all is blank. Then again sound, and motion, and touch. A tingling sensation pervaded my frame. Then a mere consciousness of existence, without thought, a condition which lasted long. Then very suddenly, thought, and shuddering terror, and an earnest endeavor to comprehend my true state. Then a long desire to lapse into insensibility. Then a rushing revival of the soul, and a successful effort to move. And now a full memory of the trial, of the judges, of the sable draperies, of the sentence, of the sickness, of the swoon, the entire forgetfulness of all that followed, of all that later day, and much earnest of endeavor that have enabled me vaguely to recall. So far, I had not opened my eyes. I felt that I lay upon my back unbounded. I reached out my hand, and it fell heavily upon something damp and hard. Then I suffered it to remain for many minutes. While I strove to imagine where it could be, I longed, yet not dared, to employ my vision. I dreaded the first glance upon the objects around me. It was not that I feared to look upon the horrible things, but that I grew aghast lest that there should be nothing to see. At length, with wild desperation at heart, I quickly unclosed my eyes. My worst thoughts then were confirmed. The blackness of eternal night encompassed me. I struggled for breath. The intensity of the darkness seemed to oppress and stifle me. The atmosphere was intolerably close. I still lay quietly and made effort to exercise my reason. Yet not for a moment did I suppose myself actually dead. The condemned to death, I knew, perished usually at the burning, and one of these had been held on the very night of the day of my trial. Had I been remained to my dungeon to await the next sacrifice, which would not take place for many months? A fearful idea now suddenly drove the blood in torrents upon my heart, and for a brief period I once more relapsed in insensibility. Upon recovering, I at once started to my feet, trembling convulsively in every fiber. I felt nothing, yet dreaded to move a step, lest I should be delayed by the walls of the tomb. It seemed evident that mine was not at least the most hideous of fates, and now I still continued to step onward cautiously. There came thronging upon my recollection 1,000 vague rumors of the hordes of Toledo. Of the dungeons there had been strange things narrated, fables I had always deemed them, but yet strange and too ghastly to repeat, save in a whisper. Was I left to perish for starvation in the subterranean world of darkness, or what fate, perhaps even more fearful, awaited me? I sought the knife which had been in my pocket when led into the inquisitorial chambers, but it was gone. My clothes had been exchanged for a wrapper of coarse serge. I had thought of forcing the blade in some minute crevices of the stonework so as to identify my point of departure. The difficulty, nevertheless, was but trivial, although, in discovery of my fancy, it seemed at first impossible. My excessive fatigue induced me to remain. The sleep soon overtook me as I lay. I resumed my tour around the prison, and with much toil came upon the last fragment of the serge. Up on the period when I fell, I had counted 52 paces, and upon resuming my walk, I have counted 48 more, when I arrived at the rag. There were in all, then, 100 paces, and admitting 2 paces to the yard, I presumed the dungeon to be 50 yards in circuit, and I met, however, with many angles in the wall, and thus could form no guess at the shape of the vault. For a vault I could not help supposing it to be. I had little object, certainly no hope in these researches, but vague curiosity prompted me to continue them. I proceeded with extreme caution, for the floor, although seeming of solid material, was treacherous with slime. At length, however, I took courage and did not hesitate to step firmly, endeavoring to cross in as direct a line as possible. I had advanced some 10 or 12 paces in this manner when the remaining of the torn hem of my robe became entangled between my legs. I saw clearly the doom which had been prepared for me, and congratulated myself upon timely accident by which I had escaped. Another step before my fall, and the world would have seen no more of me. And the death just avoided was the character which I had regarded as fabulous and frivolous in the tales respecting the Inquisition. To the victim of its tyranny there was no choice of death with its direct physical agonies, or death with its most hideous moral horrors. I had been reserved for the later. By long suffering my nerves had been unstrung, until I trembled at the sound of my own voice, and had become in every respect a fitting subject for the species of torture which awaited me. In other conditions of mind I might have the courage to end my misery at once, by a plunge into one of the abyss, but now I was the veriest of cowards. Neither could I forget what I had read in these pits, that the sudden extinction of life formed no part of the most horrible pain. Agitation of spirit kept me awake for many long hours, but at length I again slumbered. Once awakened, I gained sight of the chambers I had been held in. The truth at length flashed upon me. In my first attempt at exploration, I had counted 52 paces, up to the period where I fell. I must then have been a pace of 2 of a fragment of a surge. In fact, I had nearly performed the circuit of the vault. I then slept, and upon awakening I had returned upon my steps, thus supposing the circuit nearly doubled what it actually was. The entire surface of the metallic enclosure was rudely daubed in hideous and repulsive devices, to which the charnel superstition of the monks had given rise. The figure of the fiends in aspect of minutes, with skeleton forms and in other more really fearful images, overspread and disfigured the walls. I observed that the outlines of these monstrosities were sufficiently distinct, but the colors seemed faded and blurred, as if from the effect of damp atmosphere. As I looked beside me, I found lying by my side a plate of meat, but shortly noticed it was greatly spiced, making the thirst almost unbearable. But to my horror I saw the meal came without water. Looking upward, I surveyed the ceiling of my prison. It was some 30 or 40 feet overhead, and constructed much of the side walls. In one of the panels, a very singular figure riveted my whole attention. It was the painted figure of Time, as he commonly represented. He had held, at a glance, I suppose, to be a pictured image of a huge pendulum, such as what you see on an antique clock. I could no longer doubt the doom prepared for me by monkish ingenuity in torture. My cognizance of the pit had become known to the inquisitorial agents, the pit whose horrors had been destined for so bold a recusant as myself. The plunge into the pit I had avoided by the merest of accidents, and I knew that surprise, or entrance of torture, formed an important portion of all grotesque of these dungeon deaths. Having failed to fall, it was no part of the demon plan to hurl me into the abyss, and thus, there being no alternative, a different and milder destruction awaited me. Milder! I half smiled in my agony as I thought of such an application of a term. What boosted it to tell of the long, long hours of horror more than mortal, during which I counted the rushing oscillations of the steel, inch by inch, line by line, with a descent only appreciable at intervals that seemed ages. Down and still down it came. Days passed. It swept so closely over me as to fan me with its arched breath. The odor of sharp steel forced itself into my nostrils. I prayed. I wearied heaven with my prayer for its most speedy descent. I grew frantically mad and struggled to force myself upward against the sweep of the fearful blade. And then I felt suddenly calm, and lay smiling at glittering death. as a child at some rare toy. There was another interval of utter incivility. It was brief, for upon the lasping into life there had been no preset descent in the pendulum. But it might have been long, for I knew there were demons who took note of my swoon, and who could have arrested the vibration at pleasure. Upon my recovery, too, I felt, inexpressibly sick and weak, as if it was a long indentation. Every amid the agonies of period, the human nature craved food. It occurred to me now that the bandage which enveloped me was unique. I was tied by no separate cord. The first stroke of the razor-like crescent at any portion of the band would detach it so that it might be unwound from my person by means of the left hand. By how fearful in that case the proximity of the steel. The result of the slightest struggle, how deadly it would be. Was it likely, moreover, that the minions of torture had not foreseen to provide for this possibility? Was it probable that the bandage crossed across my bosom in the track of the pendulum, dreading to find and faint, as it seemed, my last hope of frustration? I proceeded at once, with the nervous energy of despair, to attempt its execution. For many hours, the immediate vicinity of the low framework upon which I laid had been literally swarming with rats. They were wild, bold, ravenous, their eyes red, glaring upon me as if they waited, but for motionless, on the part of me to make me their prey. At first, the ravenous animals were startled and terrified at the change, at the sensation of movement. They shrank, alarmed back. Many sought the well. But this was only for a moment. I had not counted in vain with their ferocity. Observing that I remained without motion, one or two of the boldest leaped upon the framework, and smelt the meat. This seemed to be a signal for general rush. Forth from the well they hurried in fresh troops. They clung to the wood, they overran it, and they leaped in hundreds upon my person. The measured movement of the pendulum disturbed them not at all. Avoiding strokes, they bruised themselves with the anointed badge. They passed, they swarmed upon me in every accumulating heap. They writhed upon my throat. Their cold lips sought my own. I had scarcely stepped from my wooden bed of horror upon the stone floor of the prison, when the motion of the hellish machine ceased. I beheld it drawn up by some invisible force through the ceiling. This was the lesson which desperately took my heart. My every moment was undoubtedly watched. During this period, I became aware for the first time of the origin of the sulphurous light which illuminated the cell. It proceeded from my fissure, about half an inch wide, extending entirely around the prison at the base of the walls, which thus appeared and were completely separated from the floor. I have observed that, although the outlines of the figures upon the wall were sufficiently distinct, yet the colors have seemed blurred and indefinite. These colors had now assumed, and were momentarily assuming, a startling and most intense brilliancy, that gave to the spectral fiendish portraits an aspect that might have thrilled in even firmer nerves than my own. Demon eyes, wild and ghastly, glared upon me in thousands of directions, where none had been visible before, and gleamed with the lurid luster of the fire that could not force my imagination to regard as unreal. Unreal! Even when I breathed, there came to my nostrils the breath of vapor of heated iron. A suffocating odor pervaded the prison. A deeper glow settled in each moment in the eyes that glared my agonies. A richer tint of crimson diffused itself over the pictured horrors of blood. I panted. I gasped for breath. There could be no doubt of design of my tormentors. Oh, the most unrelenting, oh, the most demonic of men. I shrank from my glowing metal to the center of the cell, aimed through the fiery destruction that impended. The idea of coolness and well came over my soul like balm. I rushed to the deadly brink. I threw my straining vision below, and glare from the enkindled roof illuminated in the inmost recesses. Yet, for a while moment, did my spirit refuse to comprehend the meaning of what I saw. At length it wrestled its way onto my soul. It burned itself upon my shuddering reason. Oh, for a voice to speak. Oh, horror, any horror but this. With a shriek I rushed from the margin, and buried my face into my hands, weeping bitterly. The heart rapidly increased, and once again I looked up, shuddering, as with a fit of ague. There had been a second chance in the cell, and now the chance was obvious in form. As before, it was vain that I first endeavored to appreciate or understand what was taking place. But not long after I left in doubt, the inquisitorial vengeance of the hurried by my twofold escape. There was no more delaying with the King of Terrors. The room had been square. I saw 2 of its iron angles were now acute, 2 consequently obtuse. The fearful difference quickly increased with a low rumbling or moaning sound. In an instant, the apartment had shifted its form from that to a longe's. But the alteration stopped not here. I neither hoped nor desired it to stop. I could have collapsed with the red walls to my bosom and the garment of eternal peace escaping me towards and closer to my death. After that, I was saved, escaping my dungeon of torment. I had been so lucky, my prayers had been answered. I had escaped near death.